My name is Casey Cappen. For those of you I have not met, I thank you for coming this evening. And we're going to be talking through the amendment for the NEWSVT Underdrain 3 treatment process. And with me tonight, I have Dennis Speckert, who's the section manager for our permitting section, and Jeff Bordeaux, who does a lot of the permitting for the landfill as well. My role is primarily looking at the water aspects of the landfill. So I do a lot of work with the water quality and including this underdrain. And so I'll be kind of introducing the permit amendment proposal this evening, but these guys are very involved as well, and that's why they're here. Our contact information is up there, and I'll put this up at the end too. If any of you need to get in touch with us, we're more than happy to talk. So like I said, I'll be doing kind of an introduction to what this amendment is. And there's currently 2 different amendments going through for this landfill, and I just want to set the stage so we all know what we're talking about this evening. It'll be really brief, about 10 minutes. We'll have a chance to ask any questions after that, and then we'll move on to the public comment opportunity. So this amendment does have a draft certification that's out right now. And this evening, in addition to hosting written comment, is opportunity for the public to weigh in on what we've drafted for the amendment, what has been submitted to us for review, and we'll take those into consideration as the process moves forward. And I'll go over at the end of this presentation kind of the approaches that you can do for making public comment. Tonight, we're looking at a treatment system for Pfas from the underdrain of the landfill. And so this is in the written documents, you may have seen it called UD3, but it is an underdrain collection system that each phase of the landfill has installed when that phase has been constructed. So Underdrain 3 was constructed a long time ago, not recently, but we are looking at the groundwater that's collected by the underdrain under this older phase of the landfill. These underdrains are gravel drainage layers that are collecting groundwater that comes in from the sides and from the base. They're installed at the landfill to keep the groundwater away from the waste net. So they're gravel blankets that intercept the groundwater before it can come in contact with the landfill infrastructure. So all of this is showing the underdrain that's built underneath any of the liner system for the landfill. So starting from that dark gray line, that screened bedding soil up. It isn't shown on this diagram, but you would then see the liner, the double liner system, and then the waste mass would be above that. So what we're talking about is intercepted groundwater within that gravel drainage layer underneath the landfill. This phase of the landfill, it all drains down through that gravel layer into a pipe, which then runs down slope and then discharges that collected groundwater. This phase of the landfill, this is the pipe where it comes out. All phases of all landfill underdrains are evaluated monthly for pH, conductivity, temperature, and flow rate, and that is reported to us in the solid waste program. This phase, UD3, has flows that have ranged from 4,000 to 13,000 gallons a day over the last year. So these are recent flow rates. In addition to these monthly reports that come in, we do have annual, semi-annual water quality analysis that's done. So like all the groundwater systems around the landfill in May and October, these underdrain discharges are analyzed for metals, volatile organic compounds, and with the 2018 certification, we added on per and polyfluoral or PFAS compounds to that analysis. This is the PFAS concentrations from UD3 since that analysis has been happening. So since that 2018 permit, you'll see the semi-annual May and October monitoring. And the concentrations that we've seen for PFAS in this underdrain have ranged from around 20 to as high as 80 parts per trillion. In Vermont, the health advisory for drinking water is 20 parts per trillion. There is no surface water standard in Vermont for PFAS, and that is what we regulate this discharge as a surface water. So when we started seeing these concentrations in the underdrain, we asked the landfill to evaluate whether this was impacting the groundwater quality downslope from this underdrain discharge. So downhill from where this pipe was coming out, we do have something called the groundwater point of compliance. So in Vermont, I will speak up. Please let me know if you can't hear me again. Apologies. In Vermont, we regulate groundwater at a point of compliance for facilities. This varies facility to facility types. For the lined landfill, which is the phase of the phase 3 of the landfill is lined. So in this area, we're looking at 150 meters from the landfill liner edge is where groundwater has to meet the Vermont groundwater quality criteria standards. Exceedances cannot be going across that boundary. So that is the location that we asked the landfill to install a groundwater monitoring well to see whether that underdrain discharge, which had elevated PFAS, was impacting the groundwater quality. That monitoring well was evaluated and did have concentrations of PFAS. It was evaluated 3 times. It had concentrations twice of around 5 parts per trillion for the PFAS compounds that are regulated in Vermont. And then it had a detection of 11 parts per trillion. So, like I said before, the Vermont drinking water standard and our groundwater standard in Vermont is 20 parts per trillion. We have not seen those concentrations in the groundwater yet, but we have something additionally, so not an enforcement standard, we have something called a preventative action level. And that's when facilities, if you have something detected at a preventative action level, need to take some action to prevent an exceedance of a standard from happening. The preventative action level for PFAS is 10 parts per trillion. So with that detection of 11 parts per trillion, we cross that threshold for preventative action in groundwater concentrations. And we ask the landfill to take action because of that. And so that is the treatment system, the PFAS treatment system that we're here to discuss this evening. What the landfill has proposed is a granulated activated carbon, or GAC, treatment system to be installed where this underdrain discharges on the slope. So this is a schematic of what that would look like. GAC systems are what are used for drinking water treatment. Typically, there are other treatment systems, but GAC is very commonly used for PFAS treatment and removal. And so this is basically a larger household system. The underdrain will gravity feed down into these canisters, which will all have granulated activated carbon in them, which will remove the PFAS. The PFAS sticks onto that carbon. And then the underdrain, the groundwater that has been collected, will discharge downslope out of these containers. GAC is capable of removing other contaminants as well. And this system allows for monitoring where the underdrain groundwater comes into the system, halfway through the system, and where it exits the system. So we can continue to see what concentrations are going in. So whether the underdrain is seeing any fluctuations in PFAS or any of the other contaminants that we look for, the metals and VOCs. We'll be able to evaluate the system at the midway point and the exit point to ensure that the system is removing the PFAS as it's expected to over time. So the amendment that was the system that was proposed to us by the landfill for the treatment of this PFAS contamination that we're seeing in the discharge. The amendment, as the program has drafted it, allows for the construction and operation of that GAC treatment system. It provides for ongoing monitoring and requires reporting of the system performance, initially every other week as the system gets up and running. And that is for the suite of contaminants that we're concerned with to make sure the system is performing as needed. It does allow for decreased monitoring if performance of the system is demonstrated to be going successfully, but not less than monthly. And the amendment, as it is drafted, adds ongoing monitoring of that groundwater monitoring well that was installed at the point of compliance, because that was installed after the 2018 certification. It amends it to include ongoing PFAS and metals and VOCs monitoring at that additional location. So those are the primary components of the amendment as drafted and that we're here to comment on this evening. All of the materials associated with this amendment are posted to the electronic notice bulletin, which is our department, Environmental Conservation's primary method for doing public comments now. So if you have any DEC permit that you're interested in following, this is the way to get the documents. So it is located, you can go to enb.vermont.gov to find this searchable system. It's not necessarily the most friendly system to like find what you're looking for in it. You should be able to search by town. If you look for anything under Coventry, you will find this permit along with others in there. But if you search by the permit ID, OL 510 is our solid waste facility ID for the landfill. So if you just put OL 510 in, you will be able to find this permit. This amendment specifically is OL 510 2022-2. So you would put that in that permit ID number, click search down at the bottom. And then you will see two different permits come up. One of them is this Underdrain amendment, which we have moved into draft certification and is ready for public comment right now. And that's the top one that's shown here. Again, you see that permit number over on the far right. The second is a proposal for a leachate management building, which would be where the potential pilot PFAS treatment systems for leachate would be operating out of. That amendment is still under consideration by our program and is not moved to the draft certification stage, which is when the public comment starts for that. So this evening is for the Underdrain PFAS treatment system. When we get to the point of having a full application for the pilot treatment of leachate, the building for leachate management that would go along with that, the same location is where you would go to see all the draft documents and drafted certification associated with that. And we will be holding a public comment period for that separate amendment process when we get to that point. So there's two amendments on there. You'll see you can open either of those. To open them, you have to click over here on the project name. This is where I think the system gets a little clunky, where it says landfills and treatment for both of them. If you click on that, it will open information specific to each of these amendments that are in our program right now. This amendment for the Underdrain treatment system is open for public comment until the end of the day, September 2nd. So another 14 days from now. Comments can be submitted orally this evening, certainly, but you can also send them in via email to me, or if you're in the E&D system, there's a comment button in the center of the screen there that you can click on, and it will do it through the system. You can attach documents or type in a comment there as well. Any comments that our program receives will be responded to through a responsiveness summary showing how we take them into consideration as we move the permit out of the draft permit, the draft certification, and towards a final decision. So that's the content of what the amendment is looking at, the amendment that we're talking about this evening, what amendments we have in our program currently, and how to comment. So I'm going to leave my contact information up there for the folks online for a minute, but we'll take it down. And I want to open it up just initially to any questions people have on what I went over in that presentation. And we can move on to the public comment opportunity after that. And I know there's going to be some overlap between those two different things. So if there's any general questions, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Initially, we'll deal with those and then we'll do the comment. I'm just going to pause you for a second and just make sure. Can folks online hear?
Yes.
Okay. Okay.
Actually, also, when you make a comment, if you could just address who you are. And then also we have a sign-in sheet that Dennis is going to pass around. If we all can put your name on there. This will now be part of the process when we have this responsiveness summary. We'll be able to send you the results.
I'm calling.
Yes.
My first question is about the preventative action level. I had understood, and perhaps I misunderstood, that it was 2 parts per trillion, not 10 in surface water.
It is in groundwater, and it is 2 parts per trillion. You are correct. I am sorry, I misspoke. It was until the most recent amendment, 10 parts per trillion, which is when the sampling of MWK1 was happening. So when it crossed that 11 threshold, at that point in time, preventative action level was 10 parts per trillion. It has since lowered and is now 2 parts per trillion. You are correct.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And then sort of related, I'm Peggy Stevens. So the Sanborn head design end of pipe standard for PFAS was to be 2 parts per trillion.
And treatment sewage into Lakeman from Magog on their side.
We will, so folks online, we just heard someone come on, we will give you an opportunity. If you want to put in the chat that you'd like to speak, we can then do that, but we'll finish here in the room first. Sorry, Peggy.
I'm just trying to clarify the numbers, because
Yes.
the numbers I'm operating in my head right now, are not the numbers I heard. Because the numbers you cited for PFAS levels also were much less than ones that I've seen previously documented that were excessive, way beyond the numbers you suggested for PFAS and also for arsenic and cadmium.
So the concentrations in the underdrain.
Yeah.
So the concentrations I showed are the concentrations for the 5 regulated compounds in Vermont, the ones that we can control or we have regulation authority over for groundwater concentrations. There are higher total PFAS. So the suite of PFAS that are looked at in the analysis is broader than that, and those concentrations are higher. So that is correct. That just what I was showing is a limited suite, but those are the ones we have groundwater regulations for.
Just wanted to clarify. And the same for the arsenic. I mean, you didn't mention the arsenic and the cadmium.
I didn't. So there is arsenic detected in this underdrain, and it's should have looked at what the highest concentration is that we've seen, but it's around 4 to 5 ppm, parts per million, that we see in that underdrain, which is what we see in many groundwater monitoring wells across the facility, including wells that are upgrading into the facility and we don't believe are impacted by the facility. So and that's in the underdrain discharge itself, or what we're seeing there. At the groundwater point of compliance, that new monitoring well that was put in, the groundwater standard for arsenic is 10 ppm, and we have not seen an exceedance of that at that groundwater point of compliance. And then for the cadmium issue, if you look at the water quality tables, it is flagged as being in exceedance. So there's a highlight that they do in that. And I think that's what you've cued in on. And if you look at it, it says less than 1.73 parts per million or whatever the concentration is for that particular sampling event. And so it is not a detection of cadmium. It is a non-detect of cadmium that the lab analysis can't get down lower than that. And so they're saying we've looked as low as we can with our analytical equipment and we aren't seeing any. The surface water standard for cadmium is just above where that lab detection limit has lied for the last several years. It's usually like 1.8, depends on the hardness of the water. So the standard fluctuates too for surface waters. They're usually very close to one another. So we can't say that there is no cadmium in it because the lab equipment can't get down to those concentrations. So that's what we call it, a technical exceedance, because the lab equipment can't do it to the standard, the surface water standard that is set for the state. So it is flagged as an exceedance. Should note that, which lab these are going through. I think, who does Wade Heindel send the lab analysis through? Is it Endyne directly for all of it? The PFAS is not done directly through Endyne. PFAS is subcontracted out.
Okay, well, I appreciate your explanation. I still feel like I wish I had the document with me because it's still not totally making sense. But I'll clarify with.
I am
later on.
glad to talk through that either with you this evening or any other time, certainly. Yes, sir.
So tell me, this system has been used before?
Granulated activated carbon systems are often used for a variety of contaminants, including PFAS. We have not used it at this landfill.
Not this landfill, but other landfills?
Yes, they are used at other landfills.
It's been successful.
Yes. Yes.
And who tested?
Granulated, I can't name a name because granulated activated carbon is used very broadly. It's used across the board for drinking water, and that is tested by anyone that's using it. So you test any of these systems, either the operator of the system or when that's reported into whatever regulating entity is overseeing that.
So this system is successful, will it eliminate the leachate deal?
Sorry, eliminate.
So eliminate the leachate, going on to sewer plants, that will eliminate that.
No, so this is not related to leachate. This is just the groundwater underneath the landfill that's collected. The leachate is all collected in the liner system above. And so this is a much smaller system than what we'd be talking about if we were discussing leachate. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Change the sample.
So we require that the landfill contract with a third party to do that and then to report into us. So Waite Heindel Environmental Management is doing the water quality analysis for the landfill right now.
Casey, we have a question online if you want to.
Yeah.
Yeah, with John Barrows. John,
Can you hear
Okay.
me?
yeah,
Hi,
we
can
can
you
hear
hear me okay?
We can.
All right, great. So you had the slide up, the amendments request under consideration. And one was the underdrain treatment system and two was the PFAS pilot testing system. If you don't get approval for number one, could you do number two?
So they are totally separate systems. Yes, and that's why they are being considered separately for this amendment process.
And then I had one more quick question. So for this underdrain system, you're collecting PFAS and other pollutants. Where are they coming from?
So that's an excellent question. In the underdrain, like Peggy Ms. Stevens was just explaining, we've seen arsenic, cadmium, and PFAS. We have not seen common contaminants that are associated with leachate. So things like chloride. There's a lot of chloride in landfill leachate. It moves easily, similar to PFAS. We'd expect to see some of those other contaminants that are commonly found in leachate to be showing up if this source was purely leachate that's getting down into the underdrain. There's a variety of land uses that have happened across the facility historically. Many of them are now known to be associated with potential PFAS contamination, not the smallest of those being the unlined landfill that is co-located on the same property, where we know we have groundwater contamination of a variety of leachate contaminants, including PFAS. So we don't have a strong fingerprint to say exactly where this PFAS is coming from at this point in time. But my interpretation is that it is not directly leachate that is totally making up all the PFAS. It is that combination of all the operations that have occurred on the facility. Are you good, John? Or
Still here, that sort of answers the question. So if I
Okay.
was out in the woods and we put in this system, I wouldn't get PFAS or are these other, or arsenic?
So you're asking if you were in a rural location, if you installed something like an underdrain and then were to analyze that for PFAS?
Yeah.
So we have done, there has been, not just in Vermont, but across the country, there's a lot of effort going into looking for PFAS contamination right now in people's residential wells and similarly as to what you said in remote locations. And we do find non-detect concentrations for PFAS across many locations. So I can't say that you certainly would find it. I also can't say you wouldn't find it. We do find it in soil concentrations. There is atmospheric deposition of PFAS. But the concentrations that we're seeing in this underdrain are elevated above what I would expect for a rural location.
So just to summarize, just make sure I understand it correctly. You're saying that it's some of the other operations throughout the Casella, the whole operation up there in Coventry that's creating these things you collect, these pollutants you're collecting in the underdrain. So it's due to the construction and whatever you've done over the years, but not. So are you saying it's the old landfill, or are you saying it's the improvements in construction and what goes on at the new lined landfill?
So I am saying that we know the unlined landfill, the old landfill, does contaminate groundwater with PFAS.
Yeah.
And that is a likely source when we're seeing groundwater that has PFAS on the property.
Is that,
But that doesn't mean there's not other sources.
right, is the unlined landfill downhill from the new lined landfill? It looks, I've driven up there and it looks like it is.
It is, I would say it's side gradient. It is
It's-
possible. It's side gradient. So the landfill is kind of horizontally located across the hill slope. So I wouldn't say it's downhill from this under drain, but it's in the same elevation zone.
But the groundwater flows down.
And the groundwater is flowing
back
towards the
river.
wetland from all of it.
Kind of, it's all
have-
flowing sort of northwest toward the Black River.
It is flowing towards the Black River, yes.
So it's pretty unlikely that the flow is not from the unlined landfill, the old landfill from 50 years ago, up to the line landfill.
So the flow would not be up to the phase, the under drain collection system. It's across the elevation zone, across gradient. And when you put in these under drain systems, you're essentially putting in a funnel that's collecting from a very broad area. So it is possible that groundwater flow from that unlined system can be
Okay.
collected with these under drains.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir. I think I saw a handout here earlier.
Just quickly, you used the word interpretation, is your interpretation that this is groundwater? I've read so much about the project, not this project, years. I interpreted it as leachate. I think there's a difference there, and I think in all of our comments, there's an assumption made that your assumption is groundwater contamination. Our assumption is that leachate.
Understood, yeah.
So there's I don't know if we need a second opinion or an arbiter, but how many, is this a staff decision of yours that you assume is groundwater? Is it your personal decision?
It is our program decision that has allowed us to move to this point of being able to draft the certification as it is. So yes, I do most of the water quality interpretation for the program, but I am not alone. It is a group of us that are looking at this and that have looked at this. Both in our program and I would say broadly, we do consult with folks in our groundwater program and our sites management program. So there are many of us.
All testing that supposedly is going on, have they even bothered testing the mud down the 12 inches? Just to see what kind of sediments, the heavy metals, toxins are settling into the bay.
So within Lake Memphremagog, that's what you're,
Pardon?
within Lake Memphremagog, is that where you're talking?
Black River, yes.
Yes, so there has been sediment work done within South Bay and across Lake Memphremagog by the watershed program. And
Now, this side and the other side of water, because up until recently, they were processing all these chemicals through the water treatment plant.
so I do not know all the locations. I do know they did a variety of them across the lake as a whole. I am not in a position tonight to speak to where those were relative to the wastewater treatment plant, but I certainly can get you that information. Yeah, so
The last
our,
3 meetings, I brought it up, and I never get into them back at all.
yes,
As soon as the meeting is done, it's kind of like, there he's out of my face again.
no,
And I don't mean to be in your face, I'm not trying to do
I
that.
am glad to get you information. I'm just afraid I don't know it
Thank you.
this evening because that is the watershed program. And I know I've seen it, but I can't articulate it this
And
evening.
if your organization approves these treatment, the amendments, both the amendments, who's going to be supervising? I'm watching, is it going to be you? Is it going to be the dump? Who's actually going to be auditing it?
Yes, so for the amendments that, these are our solid waste program amendments for this facility. The facility is regulated by a wide variety of DEC programs, and I know many of you have been involved in many meetings with some of our different programs. So our permit will require reporting by the landfill to our program, and that is the mechanism that we use for oversight. We use that, the monitoring of the system, the monitoring of the groundwater, our understanding of the facility operations and infrastructure to then judge against standards and the rule requirements, our solid waste management rules. So we are the overseeing entity for the solid waste components. There are wetlands programs and they have their own oversight, and that is done through a reporting mechanism where we ask for data to be provided to us by the landfill.
One more. While you're digging up the information for me, I really appreciate, because the last time that I heard it was 45% of the boat belt have cancerous tumors in the body. And I, you know, that's an accurate statement. It's very important for me.
Mhm.
As, I mean, I refuse to eat any fish out of the lake now. I absolutely refuse to.
Understood. Yes, that is.
So have you have any information on that?
I do not, but again, I know that the watershed program and our fish and wildlife program looked at that over last summer. And I can get you information on that and put you in touch with the people that do know, have done the bullhead work. I am not that person, unfortunately.
Now, the thing that I'm asking you, for us, I should say, are they actually going, will you actually look at this data when you make your decisions?
So I certainly will take our knowledge of what's happening in the watershed into consideration as part of this. With that said, what we're looking at is a treatment system for a very specific component of the landfill for this amendment process. So this amendment is looking at the installation of this granulated activated carbon on this underdrain. So in the context of what's going on, that certainly is something that we're constantly thinking about. That is the context of what we know of the area, certainly is in what we make these decisions for all of our permitting programs in, within the constraints of our solid waste, our rules and regulations that we have the ability to regulate through.
Part of this meeting is to change the rules.
Part of this meeting is opportunity so.
Layman's terms.
Yep, so we do, our solid waste rules they're revised, and there is public opportunity then to weigh in on what those rules look like and what those rules regulate. This opportunity tonight is to weigh in on what this amendment, how this amendment fits under our solid waste rules and how we're regulating the landfill under those rules. So not going to say it won't change the rules, but but there is a process for changing rules, and that would be a if we need to move in that direction, we would move in that direction if we didn't feel our rules were sufficient.
Is there a process that you can open for really have the state listening to what people in Northeast Kingdom are asking them to protect our watershed?
I hope that there is, and I hope that this public process is part of that, and that's why we are here tonight. And I will try my hardest to get you the information that you've asked for. Make sure I get your contact information before we leave. And in terms of like the lake watershed work that's been going on, I'm sorry that I can't speak to that this evening, but that's just not my program.
Thank you.
Well, go next to him, and then I think we have some people online, so after him, we'll go to Kay.
Just a couple quick questions. Underdrain system, is that a practice on any all permits?
So any,
That's been done with all the phases.
at this landfill, yes, with the exception of
Probably
the
the exception of the original demo.
correct.
Wasn't it that the part of the permitting to get into the next phases was that there was going to be a liner then put in the old landfill? And if they were putting a liner in the old, then there would be an underdrain system. That's my question.
That is a fair question, and I'm actually the statement that through the Act 250 permitting process, not for the most recent phase, but for the prior one, there was discussion around doing what you mentioned, the installation of a line system where the unlined material would be excavated into. I don't know off the top of my head, and I'm going to turn to the Casella folks who are more familiar with that. That predated my time with the program, whether there was a requirement for the underdrain. I think the design likely included one, but I don't know that that was a requirement.
Part of the practice of lining. If it was lined, it would be lined, like it was.
We do not require underdrain installation for landfills in Vermont. That is the practice that has been used at this site, but the solid waste rules don't require it. It would make sense at this facility. I have not looked at the engineering design for that line system to be able to comment on that. Yes. Yes. Yeah, I am. You know, I think it does include an underdrain, the proposal that has been discussed, but I haven't looked at those designs in detail. You could construct something without an underdrain. So I can't commit one way or the other because those designs haven't been submitted to the solid waste program. I think we said we were going to do one online.
Yeah, Kay, are you available online?
Yep, I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, and can the audience hear as well what the questions we're asking online?
Yes.
The in-person, okay. And also just as a heads up, I often can't, and I'm assuming I'm representative of the other folks that are listening in online and representative of a recording that I'm assuming would be made available at this meeting after the meeting closes. I can't hear often what the questions and or comments are that are coming from the audience. So I don't know if
Okay.
For perpetuity, it would make sense to maybe repeat them. The questions and the comments, you know, not
Yes.
necessarily all of it, but just summarize. That might be helpful for folks that watch this recording, assuming if a recording is made available after the fact. Okay, anyways, let me get back to, whoops. Let me get back to the chat because I just started writing my questions down in the chat, not knowing the process. All right, so what's the proven effectiveness of this proposed filtration system when it comes to removal of the 6,000 or so PFAS compounds currently in circulation? 100%, 90%, something else?
So granulated activated carbon is capable of removing to the lab detection limits all of the PFAS that are capable of being analyzed currently. So it is effective given our current analytical capabilities for PFAS. So I have no reason to suspect that it wouldn't work for the other PFAS compounds, but we only have analytic capabilities to look at a suite of them.
So it's not 100% then?
It is 100% for the analytic capabilities that we have currently.
Right, which means you can't say it's 100%.
I can say that I don't know. It
Right.
is 100% for what we are able to analyze.
Right, so if we, for instance, if the results, if the actual results, not the measured results, since the testing doesn't go down this low, but let's say it was down to half a point, a part per trillion that it was allowing through, then we wouldn't know that that was being allowed through because we can't test that low at present times, at least not that I'm aware of, but it obviously wouldn't therefore be 100% effective. And volumes would make all the difference in that case, because if it's a high level of what I think it was from memory from your presentation, it's like 13,000 gallons a day or whatever. Potentially there could be a lot of PFAS compounds passing through the system and ending up in the discharge waters. Let me get to my, my next question. I'll just get through these quickly.
I just want to comment on that for a moment and just so everyone is aware and can look for this in the amendment and think about it. We do require the analysis for PFAS. The way it's written into the permit is for any, all of the approved EPA methods are able to be used. Any approved EPA method is to be used. And I'm really sorry about that. I thought I turned it on. And that it has to be at the EPA approved analytic limits. So if that changes with time, as our labs get better at detecting these compounds, our requirements in the amendment would go along with that. And we're going to get the best analysis that the labs are able to provide through EPA approved methods.
May I continue?
Yes, please.
Okay, so you brought up the EPA, so I'll just, that segues into a later question I had, which is, given that the EPA has recently declared that there are essentially no safe levels of some of the more well-known formulations of PFAS, why does this permit rely on any allowable amount at all?
So the permit does require removal of detectable PFAS. And again, it gets to that issue of what our labs are able to detect and what we can regulate against. So the requirements that we can regulate against are our groundwater enforcement standards, our health department recommended advisories, and as those get incorporated into our rules. And so if those change over time, like you're mentioning, the EPA standards are changing, and if that is adopted here in Vermont, if those draft proposals become regulatory limits, our permits would adjust similarly. So our permit is structured to respond to what the standards and regulations are. And I acknowledge that those will change with time and that they are likely to decrease into the future.
Okay, given that may occur, there's every likelihood that may occur in Vermont. And given the limitations of a system that uses activated charcoal, I'm just curious why Casella, given the investment that this would entail, hasn't proposed a filtration system that includes a reverse osmosis component, given as my understanding, the increased effectiveness of that system over an activated charcoal system.
I think Casella has considered different treatment options. This granulated activated carbon is what has been proposed to us. I think it's capable of achieving the standards and regulations that we have in Vermont currently, and that's what we're looking at for this certification. If Casella wanted to propose a reverse osmosis, we would look at that amendment application and take that into consideration. But as we have drafted for the permit, I believe that the granulated activated carbon installation is capable of achieving our regulatory requirements currently.
Okay, and my last question is the system, you mentioned the system doesn't treat leachate specifically. Were this system to be constructed, where would the leachate that's collected on site end up going? Would it follow the same trajectory that it currently does, or is there some additional plan to deal with that?
So this underdrain treatment system is just for that underdrain, just for that image of the pipe that I showed, that single pipe. It is not for the leachate. The leachate is going to continue to be collected in the above ground storage tanks at the facility and transported to wastewater treatment facilities as it currently is operating.
So this permit, proposed permit has no allowance for the treatment of leachate at all?
This permit amendment does not.
Okay.
This is solely for the underdrain. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
This speaker, please repeat his name.
I apologize, I don't think I actually said it. Kai Forley.
That's Newport. You referenced the facility for the treatment of the pre-leachate treatment. I'm curious because that's a permit that hasn't been approved. We're all waiting for further information on that, and yet you've referenced a site where that facility would be located. That's a little disturbing.
So what we have submitted to the solid waste program right now is the construction of a building that would allow for additional leachate management area, including potential PFAS pilot systems. So what we regulate is that transport of the leachate around the facility, and that's why we're looking at that construction. You are correct that the pretreatment discharge permit has not, that was under consideration a while ago, has not been moved forward towards a final decision, but that doesn't impact our review of a building. The proposal as it is right now is that any leachate managed in that building would continue to be stored in the above ground storage tanks. It's a site where they would be able to test different infrastructure, but the ultimate management of that leachate does not change from going to the wastewater facilities like it currently is. The pretreatment permit is the mechanism that would look at that, but that is not what we're looking at with the design of the building.
A very convenient division that's really challenging for those of us who live here.
Yes, understood, absolutely. But I do think it's important it is confusing and there's many moving parts, but I do think each of our parts play a certain role. And so I do want to be clear that for the solid waste program, we're looking at the on-site facility management and containment and control of that leachate. The pretreatment permit is the mechanism for what happens to that for movement to wastewater facilities.
Casey, just a reminder to repeat the question.
Yes, sorry.
You were next.
I did have one question, but did you want to add to Pam's? No. Okay. My question to you is, you're talking about this GAC system. What are you going to do with the residuals? How is that going to be contained and prevent that from then becoming leachate?
So there are facilities that do GAC management so granulated activated carbon GAC management for PFAS. Some facilities regenerate it, some facilities dispose of it. And that would not be at the NEWSVT landfill. It would be through the contractor for the GAC management.
Who is the contractor? Is it Calgon?
I do not know because we haven't installed the system.
Well,
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I understand where you're, I'm sorry, I just forgot to repeat the question for those folks online again. The question was, what is the ultimate management of the GAC from the granulated activated carbon system? As things are changed out, the GAC does have to be managed for that PFAS that is bound onto the materials. And you should have heard my response, I hope. I think we had, yes.
I'm Effie Brown. My question is, you talked about the test well 150 feet from the actual underdrain.
From the liner, yes.
Right, the liner, okay,
Yes.
from the liner. What is the result of the testing of the actual so-called groundwater leachate itself? Not from the well, from that liquid coming out.
So from the end of that underdrain pipe?
And flowing into the wetlands.
All right. So the question from Effie Brown was whether there's been analysis of the liquid from the underdrain rather than just the groundwater monitoring well. And there has been, so that's the underdrain concentrations that I showed on, there was a little chart. We've seen for PFAS concentrations ranging from around 20 parts per trillion to about 80 parts per trillion since we've sampled that. For the 5 regulated, yes. Yeah.
Lindy Sargent, do you still have a comment?
Hi, I'm Lindy Sargent, and I'm an advisory member of the dump committee. My question continues the vein of questioning about the GAC method. Having seen the results of both the News Vermont study and then the GAC at the top of the list. And I'm also just concerned because I'm wondering why DEC is allowing the landfill contractor, News Vermont, to make this decision instead of the agency who's responsible for the environmental health of our whole state.
So you cut out a little bit there in the middle, Lindy, so I'm going to just repeat your question. Let me know if it was not what you were trying to ask. But I think you were asking who provides the regulatory oversight of that GAC management. Is that?
Well, I'll state it again and let me know if it's not working and I need to raise my volume. being aware of the studies that were done by both News Vermont and the DEC, I saw that that the GAC method was not at the top of the list in effectiveness. And so I'm curious why it was chosen. And since it sounds like it was chosen by News Vermont, I'm wondering why DEC is
Yes.
allowing the private contractor to make this decision for the health of all of Vermont and for Lake Memphremagog and the people who live around it.
I did misinterpret your question. Apologies, but thank you for repeating it. The report that you're referring to, I believe, is the Brown and Caldwell leachate treatment report. And so that is looking at treatment options for the leachate that is collected from the waste mass above the landfill liner. And so that is a very different system than this underdrain treatment system. So you are correct that that did not identify a simple GAC system as being sufficient to treat the leachate. That's because the leachate that's collected above the liner, that's going into those above ground storage tanks, has a lot of other contaminants in it. This underdrain discharge does not have that high biologic loading or other contaminants present based off of our analysis. So we've seen the arsenic that we've discussed, and we've seen the PFAS. And when you have liquids that are that different, I don't want to say clean, but don't have a lot of other contaminants in it, GAC is very effective at removing PFAS. And so that we will monitor the system to ensure that it is removing the PFAS. But we do believe it will work given the concentrations that we're seeing.
And your answer to the second question I had, please?
The oversight of
the decision, which
yes. So our program would consider anything that was submitted to us, and we would review it to make sure that it is capable of achieving whatever, for anything, not just this underdrain system, that is capable of achieving the regulatory standards that we are looking for this to be installed again for. And in this case, this is what the landfill has proposed to us. We have drafted the certification in a way that allows us to monitor it and make sure that it is achieving those regulatory standards and believe it is sufficient. Like I said earlier, there are other systems that could do this, reverse osmosis and many others. And if those were proposed to us, we would take them into consideration as well. This is what we're looking at for this draft certification. And we have been able to move to this point in the process because we believe it is capable of achieving what we needed to achieve for the regulatory standards.
May I add a follow-up question then? If this were the treatment, the pilot treatments plant for the leachate, would that be a different system that the agency, our protectors, would be looking at than the GAC?
Correct. It would not be this GAC system that would be treating the full leachate system. So this is what we're considering with this amendment is just the installation for this underdrain. It would not be for leachate. And a system of this size or this composition would not be sufficient for leachate.
Right to the back.
I think we had, yeah, I'm back here.
Tom McDowell from Newport, you've made a good talking about underdrain. I would assume that there's an underdrain 1 and an underdrain 2.
There, yes.
I would also assume that we're doing this for underdrain 3 because it shows the greatest load of PFAS. Is that correct?
Yes. So to repeat the question for those online, the question was, are there other underdrains at the landfill? And why are we talking about underdrain 3 instead of 1, 2, and the others? So the response is that there are other underdrains. Each phase of the landfill has an underdrain that's been installed. So there's underdrain 1, 2, 3. There's no phase 5 because that's the unlined system proposal so that hasn't been installed yet. And there is an underdrain 6. So we have 4 systems there. All 4 of them are monitored for PFAS and the other contaminant, the other compounds on that semi-annual basis. Underdrains 1 and 2, because of PFAS concentrations, those are the ones most immediate to the unlined landfill, are currently not discharging onto the slope and being collected, being pumped into the leachate collection system. We have the proposal for the treatment system of Underdrain 3, and we are monitoring Underdrain 6 for PFAS, and it does have PFAS detected in it. The last sampling round, the May 2022 sampling round, had 6 parts per trillion for those 5 regulated compounds detected in it. We haven't hit that regulatory threshold to require something like a treatment system at those other locations yet. So that's why we're talking about Underdrain 3, is because we have the concentrations, we have the known impact to groundwater quality.
So I guess my question is, given all that, then what would be your interpretation as to why Underdrain 3 is showing the highest PFAS, if in fact we're just looking at background levels of PFAS in the groundwater, that we're not looking at contamination from the landfill?
Yeah, so the question was, why is Underdrain 3 the highest? And I just want to clarify that it is not the highest for PFAS. Underdrains 1 and 2 have been analyzed, and they do have higher concentrations than Underdrain 3 did. And that's the approach for management of those, is to collect it as part of the leachate collection system. So those are no longer discharging to the environment. This one currently is discharging, and we have that impact to groundwater. That is our preventative action limit. So they have to take some, we requested that they take some action to make sure that a standard is not exceeded. And this is their proposal for that. So there are higher concentrations in the underdrains. Those are being managed differently. This system is just for this underdrain.
And what's your sense of the source of PFAS and other?
It is the same as what I stated. The question, I'm really terrible about repeating, so apologies.
I'm just trying to get at
Yes.
variability here.
The question was, what might the sources be for those other underdrains? And my response is going to be the same as what it was for Underdrain 3. You know, we have a known unlined landfill that we know has high concentrations of PFAS impacting groundwater at the facility. We also have the other historic land uses, and groundwater communicates with itself across the area. And so we don't have a fingerprint that we can say, yes, this is the unlined landfill and this is something else that happened. And we're managing for the standards that we have.
Thank you.
Thank you. Brian Smith, Derby. How regular is A&R on site? Are they daily or monthly or weekly or?
So the question was, how regularly is A&R at the facility? And so I can say our program is up there regularly, not daily, but when there's activities that we need to oversee, we are on site. Right now, there's construction activities, and we do try and make it up every other week or so.
Every other week?
We ensure that someone is on site.
Wouldn't it behoove natural resources to be there more regular than that, considering the size of the facility?
So we are on site, but I will say that we're providing oversight through the reporting requirements of our permit as it is, and other mechanisms that is beyond that site visit. So yes, it'd be great to spend a lot of time providing oversight, but we are a limited staff. We're providing the oversight that we feel is sufficient to ensure that the landfill is meeting our regulatory requirements.
Thank you.
This landfill will close.
Could you repeat your name again?
Holly Jones.
Holly Jones.
John Barrows, can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
All right, based on the fact that this landfill will close, there will be a time when this landfill closes, hopefully sooner rather than later. Why go through the expense and continual maintenance of putting in this activated carbon system when you could treat this underdrain as leachate, just as in UD1 and UD2?
So the question was, given that the landfill is going to close, why install a treatment system that has ongoing management and operation rather than collect it as leachate? Is that an accurate summary? So the Underdrain 3 could be collected and managed as leachate. The infrastructure is there to do that. And You know, if there's a reason, if we see, if this treatment system doesn't work, that's definitely an approach we could take. Right now, what they've proposed is the installation of this granulated activated carbon system. And that will meet our regulatory requirements.
Yeah, okay, I'm just gonna follow up on that.
Yeah.
Because we know the EPA has already set an advisory for PFAS. Pretty soon that's going to trickle down, excuse the pun. It's going to trickle down to all of us, and there will be a PFAS standard. And the state of Vermont is going to either meet or exceed that PFAS standard. We hope, right? Our green state is.
So a health advisory standard, yes.
No, we're going to have more than a health advisory standard. We're going to have water quality standard for PFAS, which we will have to do. Why would Casella go to the expense of putting in this system when they can simply treat it as leachate, which it is polluted? It could be on some levels considered leachate. We'll call it whatever we want to do. Call it. Doesn't matter. It is polluted. So what do you see as being the economical solution for this problem, rather than saying, well, Casella will put in this system now, right? But this system may not be adequate very shortly in the future. I don't think that's fair to them either. It's not fair to us. It's not fair to them.
So if I were to re-articulate that, and I'm hoping Polly will give me a nod.
See if John heard it.
Were you able to hear that clearly, John? Okay. Thank you, Polly. I think, so the discussion around what the health advisories or water quality standards or whatever may be coming in the future for regulatory limits on PFAS in any media. If they are set as regulatory limits, the landfill will have to achieve them, whether it's through this granulated activated carbon system, or if it is collecting it as leachate or some other treatment technology. Our role in the solid waste program is to ensure that they meet those standards and that we hold them to those regulatory limits. Their approach on doing that does have to be approved by us, but we will consider any of those approaches. So what we have before us right now is this granulated activated carbon. If that proves to be not sufficient through our monitoring, or because standards change over time and it can no longer achieve those standards, we would be reevaluating other options at that point.
So said, but how does Casella feel about that?
I can't answer that.
Casey, I'm sorry. Got two questions online from Teresa and then John Tuttle.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hi, I'm Teresa, and I'm also a member of the Dump Advisory Committee. I've met some of you before. I had a question, Casey, you used an example of chloride as being something that you're not seeing in the underdrain discharge. So therefore you made a conclusion that you felt that since that wasn't in the underdrain, then the contamination wasn't coming from leachate. Is that a correct statement? Is that what you said? I don't want to portray you in a way that wasn't what you meant.
Yeah, no, I think that generally does summarize it. What I said is we're not seeing common leachate contaminants present in this underdrain. Things that if the leachate were going straight to that underdrain, I would expect to see there.
Right, but isn't it true that those common contaminants aren't forever chemicals? So they wouldn't necessarily persist for the amount of time going through soil and all that forever chemicals would. So I'm not sure you can conclude necessarily that the leachate isn't leaking into the ground in some fashion to produce this PFAS.
So like I said, we don't have a fingerprint to say where this PFAS is coming from. And what we do have to rely on is the other fingerprints that we do have, like those other leachate contaminants that I mentioned. As our understanding of PFAS improves, I can't say that we won't be able to make those connections. But this is based off of the information and the data that we have right now. My understanding is that this treatment system will be capable of removing the PFAS we have detected.
Okay. And the second question I had is just a second ago, you talked about some PFAS was found in an underdrain. It was either 4 or 6. I'm not sure which one. It was 6 parts per trillion. Is that what you
Yes,
said?
that was phase 6 underdrain.
Okay, and didn't you recently say that 2 parts per trillion is the action level?
For groundwater. And so
Which
that is, so the underdrain discharges are considered surface waters for our regulatory limits. And we do look at the groundwater down gradient down slope of them to see where we do have PFAS standards for groundwater to see the impact. And so that 2 parts per trillion is in groundwater. The 6 parts per trillion is in the underdrain 6 discharge, which we regulate as surface water.
And do you have a monitoring well that's close to the underdrain 6 that's monitoring the groundwater down gradient from that?
We do have monitoring wells installed around the area around down gradient of underdrain 6. We have not currently evaluated them for PFAS. This May's the May 2022 results are the first time we've seen PFAS in that underdrain, and we certainly will be evaluating that going forward.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks. John Tuttle, do you have a question?
Yeah, I'm here, but I'm in a noisy spot with a weak connection. I wonder if you could just go to chat and look at my questions there, please.
All right. Might take a second. Do you want to ask your question and then I'll go back to yours, John?
That's fine. I'm going to mute again. Thank you.
I'd like to know is, when did DEC start monitoring groundwater?
So the question was, when did our program start requiring monitoring of this underdrain for PFAS? For PFAS, it was with the 2018 certification. So it started that next spring. We have had monitoring for the other contaminants, the metals and VOCs since installation of the underdrain.
Mentioned that there was chemicals that exceeded. Has that been consistent since you've been monitoring since 2018? That's
so within the underdrain, it's sorry, the question was, I had made a statement that the chemicals are in exceedance of state standards. The question was whether that's been since monitoring has happened. So the underdrain, we started monitoring that with the 2018 certification. There is no standard for the underdrain. When we saw the concentrations in that underdrain, we requested the installation of the monitoring well for groundwater, which is where we have a standard. The first 2 sampling rounds were below the preventative action level at that time. The third one was above. That's when we had that 11 parts per trillion detection. And that was when we started this conversation about managing for the groundwater. So we haven't exceeded a standard. We've exceeded the preventative action level.
And third question. Permit putting up a building here for the CAT system. And prior meetings you had, you said that you were considering Coventry on Montpelier. Does this mean that you've made a decision that it's going to be in Coventry? I assume that you're not going to turn around and have to tear the whole system out and move it later. So has that decision been made that the system will be followed here, and after, if the testing goes well, that this will be the site?
So the question was with if this were to move to a final decision of approval and this building and GAC treatment system were installed, does this mean we've made a decision on whether it's Newport or Montpelier? And I just want to clarify that discussion around Newport or Montpelier has been for leachate treatment. So the liquids collected above the landfill liner. And that was part of the pretreatment discharge permit discussion when that Newport versus Montpelier issue came up. This GAC treatment system is not for that leachate. It's just for this underdrain on site, just that single discharge. So this amendment does not consider the leachate pretreatment.
We got one comment online and this is from John Tuttle. Has DEC required hydrogeologic studies of the groundwater flow velocity between the landfill site and surface water, and more generally, the lake? And then his second question is regarding the GAC, how will be managed, what I think you responded to, and then the estimated quantities.
So for the first question on whether we've done hydrogeologic evaluation to understand groundwater connection to surface water flow, that certainly has been done throughout the lifetime of the landfill. There's requirements before construction, and then we have the ongoing monitoring of the groundwater and surface water locations that are part of our permit. And that all informs our understanding of groundwater flow and surface water connection. And I'm happy to provide any of those hydrogeologic reports to you. Feel free to reach out for those. And if you have a specific question in there about our understanding, I'm glad to answer that as well. For the GAC management, I do think I commented on that earlier. There are a variety of options for GAC regeneration or disposal, but that would not be occurring here at the NEWSVT landfill.
Then part of that question was estimated quantities.
I should know that number off the top of my head. It is in the application. It is going to depend on what the concentrations in the underdrain continue to be over time. But I am not drawing a number up currently, and I apologize for that.
Next out, wait, come back.
But we can get you that information. Like any of this, feel free to reach out to us and I can solve my memory.
My name is Frederick Tiponesar, and I'm with the Member of Conservation on the Canadian Planning Board. My question was a while back, so I'm sorry we skipped over this topic already, but I'm not familiar with these technicalities, so I just wanted to ask you, on what basis did you decide to interpret the groundwater versus leachate situation? Like, what was the basis for this decision in your team?
All right, so the question is, how did we make that decision of groundwater versus leachate management and where these liquids are coming from? Is that, yeah, okay. So that is based off of the contaminants we're seeing in this underdrain discharge. Again, it's limited to the arsenic and PFAS exceedances, and we're really not seeing much else detected that we would expect if we had some direct leachate connection. So leachate is the liquid that is in contact with the waste mass, and that should be contained by our double liner system above the underdrain installation. Like we've mentioned, this facility does have an unlined landfill on property that doesn't have that lined system to contain the leachate. And so we do have some communication between the leachate to groundwater in that area. Is that helpful?
Thank you.
We'll get you next after.
Peggy Stevens again. I should have said before, I'm also an advisory member of DOM as well, but I'd be here even if I weren't. I guess I just want to reiterate for everybody's understanding the confusion when we did talk about total PFAS. So as the previous Mr. A, I can't, Orley or something.
Yes.
Noted, there's a class of maybe 9,000 chemicals of PFAS, right? So when we talk about the measurements and whether or not they exceed the drinking water standard of 20 parts per trillion, it's only for 5. So, and then discussing the flow of up to 13,000 gallons daily with all of those other potential PFAS chemicals being there. It just does seem like it would be a great concern, what the concentrations in the GAC might become in a short amount of time. And I know that when I was reading the Sanborn head design, it said that the GAC filters would be returned to the landfill. So if that's not the case, it's new information to me tonight because I'm just going off of what I read in the Sanborn head design. So I guess I just want to really emphasize that level of concern that the gentleman previously raised, that, the potential PFAS entering the wetlands and then onto the surface waters of the Black and ultimately to the lake could be much higher than the ones we're talking about tonight.
So yes, thank you, Peggy. To summarize that question, I think you're trying to get at that potential pass-through of the unregulated PFAS through granulated activated carbon and our management of that.
Whether
And then
it's a pass-through or whatever gets captured being returned to the landfill, which would then ultimately concentrate those chemicals in the future leachate, which is what the science, it flies in the face of science. Science says that practice should not occur, and that these GAC should be solidified and then held in some kind of, vault to prevent the contamination of the environment in the future.
of other locations. So the add-on to the question was on the management of that GAC and stabilization of the PFAS within the GAC. Is that an accurate summary? For the component of what may be passing through the PFAS compounds that may be passing through GAC or being bound in the GAC and concentrating there that we're not able to analyze yet. Like I said earlier, we're limited by the analytic capabilities that we have. And the way the permit is structured, the landfill is required to monitor by EPA approved methodologies. And as that suite of PFAS compounds that are able to be analyzed and that the EPA has approved through those methods and have confidence that we're able, the requirements of this permit will require those to be additionally analyzed. We are not at a point scientifically that we're able to do that for all, whatever the world of PFAS is. There's a variety of numbers that are tossed out there for the suite of compounds. Again, with our program and our rules, we're looking at our regulatory limits. Those regulatory limits will adjust as our scientific knowledge adjusts, and those requirements would be incorporated. And I welcome feedback as you look at this drafted amendment on whether you think that is true or not. But the landfill would be required to meet the regulatory limits. Those regulatory limits will adjust as our science adjusts.
So I guess I would just add, getting back to what Paula's point was, knowing that the EPA guidance for PFO and PFOS are like 4 parts per quadrillion now, which, who can even conceive of that? Why not be proactive and develop, really be seeking a much more stringent system that would do the job to the degree that's going to be required and that we basically already know is required. I just fail to understand why that doesn't make no sense. I'm sorry, it's hard for me to wrap my head around it. So
No, it's hard for all of us. Everything is rapidly developing and it is a lot to keep track of. I acknowledge that. I think, so the question was, if we know things are going to be lowered dramatically, why don't we build a system now? And I think my response to that is that the system is capable of achieving the lab detection limits that we have in place, or it will remove PFAS to those lab detection limits. Those lab detection limits aren't where the draft health advisories are, but we don't know that it's not going to achieve those either because we can't analyze at that level. If we get to a point where there is a regulatory limit that is that low and the labs are able to achieve those detections that low, that would, and it is set in Vermont as a regulatory limit. We will respond to that through our rules and regulations and our certifications.
I think we're making a circle. Polly Jones again. I'm sorry, but
we
I'm
get
just
some.
adding on to this, and I promise I won't take about a minute. I'm just adding on to this. We're talking about preventative measures. why don't we take that preventative measure right now? That's all. I'm sorry.
I might argue that we are taking that preventative measure. So the installation of this GAC system is what we have proposed for the removal of PFAS to achieve what we have for standards here in Vermont, which are based off of their health drinking water standards for groundwater. Our drinking water standards are our groundwater standards. And so we will be achieving, the goal of this work is to achieve our groundwater standards, which are drinking water standards here in Vermont at that point of compliance, and to clean it out of that discharge, the underdrain discharge.
Way out back.
Yes, we're going to page report, and I'm just going to change focus a little bit. Mentioned that Casella is going to be a project. Is that correct, or is the federal funding coming through ARPA funds or what? And do you know what the cost of this project will be? And if this amendment is approved, when will the project start? When will it be?
So the question was, what is the source of funding for the installation of this system? And what the timeline is for installation of this GAC system. Is that accurate? So we have requested that Casella propose a way to get this PFAS out of the groundwater. This is the proposal we have. They are funding it. It is not state funds at all. We are responding to what they've submitted to us with this draft certification. As far as the timeline goes, the construction of anything liquid-based gets more complicated in the winter. If this permit moves to a final decision, construction of the facility, the buildings per our program can start immediately. Logistically, that has winter complications. I cannot put a finite point on when this will be installed at this point. I do not.
Is this perhaps the least expensive method of
So again, and I apologize if it feels like I'm just saying the same thing, because I am, but this is capable of achieving our regulatory requirements. And that is what we're looking at in our review, and that's what the amendment is addressing.
I don't know if there's a simple answer to this, but you keep talking about our capabilities analysis. Can you quantify that in some way?
So the question was, can I quantify the limits of our analytic capabilities? And I'm not sure how to respond to that question. So there are EPA approved methodologies, and those methodologies do have requirements that the labs must achieve certain detections. And so that is the quantification for each of those methodologies, is what the EPA approval is. And I'm not sure that's getting to the point of your question. I'm not sure I'm following.
I knew it was going to be more complicated than I wanted to be. You can measure 2 parts per trillion, 1 part per trillion, half a part per trillion. How refined is your ability to measure one of these chemicals at present?
So the question now is,
that was what I meant to do.
Yes, yeah. Like what are the lab detection limit capabilities? I'll respond to that part first. We can follow up as needed. So there are different analytic approaches and methodologies out there. The EPA has approved a suite of them and is in the process of approving a larger suite. Each of those different methodologies, as they're approved, are for different media types, for water, for soils, for air, and have different detection limits associated with them. So there are analytic approaches that can get lower detection limits that are not EPA approved, and the labs haven't been able to standardize that approach across the board. For the EPA approved, the ones that we require through our the analytic methods that we require through our certification currently, the detection limits are typically it varies compound to compound, but they're around 2 parts per trillion for those compounds.
Yeah. What's being set aside if you're finished these underground. Just on this permit. What is the play? Funding down the road and the liability responsible of discovery maybe on this one that's not lined, for example, that should be. And the one you're dealing with right now that we're talking about. What is their?
Yes, so the question, if I paraphrase it, and I'll look for a nod if I'm doing this correctly, is for moving into closure and post-closure down the road, what is the funding mechanism to make sure that we can keep operating this system and any of the other systems at the facility? Is that accurate? So through our solid waste program, and Act 250 is a separate funding process. I'm just going to speak to the solid waste part right now. We do require funds for closure. So to be able, if the landfill operator were to walk away today, the state would have access to money to do closure as we've currently approved it. So based off of what the facility operations are right now, we would be able to take those funds, cap it, close things up. And then we have separate funds for the post-closure management. So to keep systems like this granulated activated carbon system running for the post-closure period.
So it wasn't part of your permitting.
And the funding for this component, the specific granulated activated carbon, if we move to a final decision that is an approved certification, we would get post-closure funds for this. Because the system wouldn't close, it would keep operating. It doesn't affect the closure funds. Our rules require a rolling 30 years of post-closure funds to be maintained. So we get annual updates based off of the facility operations on what those closure and post-closure funds need to be. If it moves, if the landfill goes into closure and they're closed for 10 years, they still have to have an additional 30 years post-closure funds. It's always 30 years into the future that we require those post-closure funds to be held. And those funds are for the state access, not for the use of actual post-closure activities at the landfill. So we always have 30 years into the future.
And
funding
happens on liability. There is obviously.
So the
31 years down.
So the holding of the post-closure funds does not relieve liability. The state does have the ability for any contaminated site in the state to go after any former owner or operator for funding.
So it could be for the unlined. Part of the permit originally was to be lined. And so now you have the space to take a foot and then do your underground and do the lining, then put it back in. This is all going to get packed up and left. That's not going to get fixed.
So
This is what's going to happen.
to re-articulate the question as I'm hearing it right now is the post-closure funds, or sorry, the closure and post-closure funds, how do they deal with the unlined landfill?
Funds are there enough to take care of that too?
So the solid waste program has not required the removal of that unlined landfill currently, or looked at a design for that. So we do not. I do just want to be clear that is separate. That's a separate discussion. I'm glad to have that discussion separate from this amendment permit for this evening. Heard.
Thank you.
Good. 1 second. John Barrows, do you have your hands up? Did you have a question? You're on mute.
I need you to help me understand that. When you say that these are being recommended, the suggestions to put in this treatment. Is that being suggested by someone?
So the question is, when I've talked about things being suggested, is that been suggested by Casella? And I think, and let me know if I'm wrong, but I've said we've looked at the proposal by Casella, and that's this application that we received for this treatment system. So we required them to do something. This has been Casella's proposal or suggestion on what will meet our regulatory limits, and that's what we reviewed for this permit.
So you're reviewing what Casella is proposing.
Correct?
You are the state of Vermont Agency of Natural Resources, correct?
Correct?
Okay. I can't get my head around how the individuals who are contaminating our state is in charge. I mean, it's the tail wagging the dog here. Why is it the Agency of Natural Resources that the reins on this?
So the question is, I think, why isn't the agency making a determination on what system needs to be installed? Is that
your job?
It is our job to hold Casella as an operating facility to our regulatory requirements. The approach that they take to meet those requirements could vary. There are a variety of approaches that they could take. If what they have proposed was not capable of achieving our regulatory requirements, we would push back and say, this won't meet what our requirements are, and they would have to respond to something else. So our requirement is that they achieve the environmental quality at the groundwater quality at that point of compliance. This is the approach they've suggested on how to do that. We will monitor, and the permit amendment requires that monitoring to show that that is being successfully done. And that is our oversight that we provide.
I've been sitting here for over an hour and I hear an awful lot of, we think this will work. None of this would ever hold up in any court of law. How is it going to hold up? I mean, the people here are going to suffer from this.
So the question or the comment is the comments that we made around, we think this is going to work, or this is an approach that we're trying. How do we know it's going to work, and would that hold up in a court of law? Is that an accurate summary?
All I'm saying is, what you're saying would not hold up in the court of law anywhere. We are probably one of the smallest states. What do you have? One or two states in this country smaller than us. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. There's many states here much larger than we are who have fought these battles. Why are we listening to Casella on what they think is the right thing to do?
So I will state that granulated activated carbon is utilized by many locations, and we are not relying on Casella to that will function. We are relying on our knowledge of the system as it's been proposed in this amendment, and that it will be installed according to our requirements, and the monitoring of that system. So we will have ongoing monitoring after this has been installed to make sure that they are achieving what it needs to achieve and what they have said it will achieve in this application amendment. We are not relying on it. We will monitor and assess ongoing.
Next question.
Is there a tentative closing date for this landfill?
For the landfill, this amendment does not look at the operation of the landfill and does not consider that. So the 2018.
Is there a tentative closing date?
The 2018 certification was for the current expansion area, which had the 22-year lifespan, and that is what our solid waste program has approved in that operating.
I'm not going to get at what the gentleman was saying. If there was a tentative closing date, how long would it take to find another site to get set up and be ready to operate when the gate gets locked here in Coventry? 10 years?
So the question was, if this landfill, when it does close, what is the timeline for installation of another landfill? And I just want to acknowledge that that's not what the amendment's looking at for what we're here tonight. I will state that it does take a significant amount of time, and the solid waste program is willing to look at anyone's submittal of a new site and design and potential operations of any landfill in the state.
If anybody has a question online, if you could raise your hand and we'll get to you next.
Still online for you.
Any other questions? We'll get to you after.
Yeah. My name is Jim Campbell. I have a question. Are there other sites being considered currently? Number one, and number two, the second part of my question is, you mentioned earlier, limited your size and what you can monitor, not monitor there. But my question to you is, you mentioned that you're requiring certain monitoring to be done over your agency or Casella. Who's paying specifically for that monitoring? It's a two-part question.
So the question was,
are there other sites?
Are there other landfill sites in the state that are under consideration for potential disposal options? And the solid waste program has one very small site in Sheldon that has a tentative design in place. It is not approved for disposal by any means, but it is a very small location, limited tonnage capacity. And that is the only other location that we have reviewed for any disposal options. And there are no others that are been proposed to us at this time.
I think he was next.
Well, I have a second part of the question here too. The second part of the question was monitoring over in a.
The extra monitoring you're requiring, state requiring, funding that.
So the monitoring that this permit is requiring?
Yeah.
So the additional monitoring of this underdrain and the monitoring, the groundwater monitoring well will be paid for by Casella. Paid for by Casella. It is a requirement of their permit.
If I understand it correctly, Casella would be the one paying this company to monitor what they're doing.
It will be paying a third party to do the monitoring and then submit it to us for our review.
And the state doesn't see that as dangerous. I mean, in terms of, I'm paying you to pretty much give me the results I need.
We are counting on and considering the professional accreditation of the companies that are doing this work.
Wow.
And that is what is done across the state.
I think you're next up.
It isn't working here. It does look like it's working on his. I think my computer lost connection, but.
They're on.
They're still there. I'm sorry. I was trying to figure that out too. Appreciate it.
If you want him to go.
My understanding is the EPA is going to change the guidelines, correct?
The EPA has proposed new draft health advisories recently, and there are a number of other standards and guidances that they've committed to releasing in the next year.
But in the next year or two.
Yes, yes.
So if that's the case, why would Stella invest all this money to set up a treatment plant at these lower levels? Why wouldn't you wait until you knew what guidelines you're gonna have? From a business perspective, it doesn't sound like to invest $250,000 in the system that's going to be outdated before you use it.
So they are installing it to meet our requirements that we currently have in place. So we do have groundwater enforcement standards for Vermont that are in place. And this treatment system will achieve those. And it will need to achieve any other standards that are ever established in the state of Vermont for surface water, groundwater, or other media.
So it's 6 months before we came up with these new guidelines.
Our permitting structure requires compliance with standards that are current. So if the standards change, the requirements change, the rules change with them.
How much time does the applicant have to change once the standards change?
That's an excellent legal question that I am not in a place to answer right now. When the standards are established, and there is with the groundwater standards, the water quality standards, there's a public comment process that goes along with that. It's not as though the standard comes out tomorrow unannounced. So when it is established, it is established. And the requirement is that you meet those standards for any operating facility.
All right, next.
I've tried to listen for an hour and 3/4. And I have a lot of concerns. I won't even go into, but I'm prompted by what this gentleman asks. I think you're referring to Casella's latching on to what they call vested rights. So if they put in a $250,000 system under the existing rules, which are not strict, vesting rights would allow them to continue that project for probably the 10-year lifetime, which is outlined in this project. I don't understand that 10-year lifetime at all. I'd like to get back to what Mr. Campbell addressed. I have the floor. He put his finger on a very, very important issue. And that is, what is true third-party objectivity? You're always referring to third-party consultants. Well, I can look in this room